What happens when two teenagers with nothing but determination and a stolen ID card manage to infiltrate one of the most secure military installations in the country? What happens when every single warning sign is dismissed, every security protocol ignored, and every opportunity to stop a catastrophe is wasted? In just 48 hours, sisters Sarah and Emma Mitchell would prove that sometimes the greatest threats come not from enemy nations or terrorist organizations, but from the very people those in power choose to underestimate. This is the true story of how two young women brought down an entire military base, not through violence or destruction, but through something far more dangerous: the truth. The morning of October 15, 2019 began like any other, at Fort Garrison Military Research Facility in Nevada. Colonel Marcus Webb stood at his office window, watching the sunrise paint the desert landscape in shades of gold and amber. The facility, buried deep in the Mojave Desert and surrounded by miles of restricted airspace, was considered one of the most secure installations in the United States. For 15 years, Webb had overseen operations here, and in all that time, not a single security breach had occurred. He took pride in that record, perhaps too much pride. What Colonel Webb didn't know was that at that very moment, two sisters were sitting in a rented Honda Civic 3 miles from the facility's main gate, studying satellite images on a laptop computer. Sarah Mitchell, 22 years old with sandy blonde hair and the determined eyes of someone who had seen too much, adjusted her borrowed military uniform one final time. Beside her, her younger sister Emma, 19 and barely 5 feet tall, nervously fingered the fake identification card they had spent months perfecting. The sisters had not always been criminals or infiltrators. Just 6 months earlier, they had been ordinary civilians living ordinary lives. Sarah worked as a data analyst for a small tech company in San Francisco, while Emma was finishing her sophomore year studying computer science at UC Berkeley. Their father, Master Sergeant David Mitchell, had served at Fort Garrison for over a decade before his sudden death in what the military had classified as a training accident. The official report stated that Sergeant Mitchell had suffered a fatal heart attack during routine physical training. Case closed, no questions asked, benefits paid, condolences offered. But the sisters knew their father better than anyone. David Mitchell was a fitness enthusiast who ran marathons and had passed every physical examination with flying colors. He had called Sarah just 2 days before his death, his voice filled with an urgency she had never heard before. He spoke in code using childhood references only his daughters would understand, telling them about the broken toys in the sandbox and how someone needed to clean up the mess before the other children got hurt. Sarah had assumed he was talking about some minor military bureaucracy issue. She had been wrong. The first real clue came when they were cleaning out their father's personal effects. Hidden behind a family photograph in his wallet, Emma discovered a small piece of paper with a series of numbers and letters. At first they thought it might be some kind of military code or perhaps coordinates. Emma, with her computer science background, quickly realized it was something else entirely: a file path and password combination. Their father had left them a digital breadcrumb trail. Using Emma's university computer lab and her considerable hacking skills, the sisters managed to access their father's military email account. What they found there changed everything they thought they knew about their father's death and about Fort Garrison itself. Over the course of several weeks, they pieced together a horrifying picture of systematic corruption, illegal weapons testing, and cover-ups that went all the way to the Pentagon. The training accident that killed their father had been anything but accidental. David Mitchell had discovered that Fort Garrison was being used as a testing ground for experimental chemical weapons, weapons that were prohibited under international law. Worse still, these weapons were being tested on unknowing military personnel under the guise of routine training exercises. Several soldiers had become seriously ill, and at least 3 had died under mysterious circumstances. When their father tried to report these activities through proper military channels, he was told to keep quiet and mind his own business. But David Mitchell was not the kind of man who could stand by and watch innocent people suffer. His final emails revealed that he had been preparing to go public with evidence of the illegal activities. He had gathered documentation, recorded conversations, and even managed to obtain samples of the chemical agents being used. The night before his death, he had arranged to meet with a journalist from the Washington Post who specialized in military corruption stories. That meeting never happened. David Mitchell was found dead in the base gymnasium at 6:30 a.m., apparently having suffered a massive heart attack during his morning workout. The journalist, meanwhile, received a phone call that same morning, informing her that her source had died and that the story was no longer viable. No autopsy was performed, per military protocol for deaths occurring on base. The body was cremated quickly before the family could object. The sisters spent weeks wrestling with what to do with this information. Sarah wanted to go to the media immediately, to expose everything their father had died trying to reveal. Emma, more cautious by nature, argued that they needed more evidence, something concrete that couldn't be dismissed or covered up. They tried reaching out to several journalists, but without their father's physical evidence, which had apparently disappeared from his quarters, they found themselves with nothing but copies of emails and their own testimony. It was Emma who first suggested they needed to get inside Fort Garrison itself. She had been studying the base's digital infrastructure and had discovered several vulnerabilities in their network security. If they could physically access the base's computer systems, she believed they could download the evidence they needed, including the files their father had mentioned in his final communications. Sarah initially thought the idea was insane. Fort Garrison was a restricted military facility with multiple layers of security. Even getting close to the perimeter would be dangerous, and attempting to infiltrate the base would be virtually impossible. But as the weeks passed and their attempts to interest journalists and government officials in their story continued to fail, the idea began to seem less crazy and more like their only option. The planning took months. Emma used her computer skills to research the base's layout, security protocols, and personnel schedules. She discovered that Fort Garrison, despite its high security rating, relied heavily on automated systems and had surprisingly few human guards during certain shifts. The facility's isolation in the desert meant that most security measures were designed to keep people out from a distance, rather than to detect infiltrators who had already made it inside the perimeter. Sarah, meanwhile, focused on the human element. She created false identities, acquired military uniforms through online auction sites, and even managed to obtain legitimate-looking identification cards through a contact she had made in her data analysis work. The cards wouldn't hold up under intensive scrutiny, but they might be good enough to get them through an initial checkpoint, especially during a busy shift change. The sisters also discovered that their father had maintained a friendship with a civilian contractor who worked on the base's computer maintenance. Through careful questioning, they learned that this contractor, Tom Bradley, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with some of the activities he had witnessed at Fort Garrison. Bradley had been their father's source for much of the evidence he had been gathering, and he was willing to help the sisters, though he was too frightened to come forward publicly himself. Bradley provided them with crucial information about the base's layout and security procedures. He also gave them a legitimate contractor access card that he reported as lost, but which would still work for another week before being deactivated. This card would allow them to access areas of the base that even military personnel couldn't enter without special authorization. The final piece of their plan involved timing. Emma had discovered that Fort Garrison was scheduled to host a major inspection by Pentagon officials in early November. In preparation for this inspection, the base was conducting intensive training exercises and security drills throughout October. These activities would create confusion and provide cover for the sisters' infiltration attempt. Security personnel would be focused on the exercises rather than on routine access control, and the increased activity on the base would help them blend in. On the morning of October 15th, as Colonel Webb stood at his window enjoying the sunrise, Sarah and Emma were making their final preparations. They had rehearsed their cover story dozens of times. They were civilian contractors hired to update the base's computer security systems in advance of the Pentagon inspection. Emma carried a laptop loaded with legitimate security software and fake work orders, while Sarah had memorized the names and schedules of key personnel they might encounter. At exactly 9:30 a.m., the sisters drove up to Fort Garrison's main gate. The guard, Corporal James Martinez, was 3 hours into a 12-hour shift and already looking forward to his lunch break. He had processed dozens of contractors and delivery personnel that morning, all part of the increased activity in preparation for the upcoming inspection. When Sarah handed him their identification cards and work orders, he gave them only a cursory glance. Martinez was supposed to call in all contractor arrivals to verify their legitimacy, but the phone system had been experiencing problems all morning due to some kind of technical issue with the base's communications network. Emma had, of course, caused these technical issues by remotely accessing the base's phone system and introducing a subtle software glitch that would cause intermittent outages without triggering any major alarms. After a brief check of their vehicle for obvious contraband, Martinez waved them through. The first barrier had been crossed with surprising ease. Sarah drove slowly through the base, following the route Emma had mapped out using satellite imagery and Bradley's inside information. Their destination was Building 7, a nondescript concrete structure that housed the base's main computer servers and data storage systems. Building 7 was located in the heart of the facility, surrounded by other administrative buildings and close to the base commander's headquarters. It was, in many ways, the most secure location on the entire base, which made it the perfect place to hide evidence of illegal activities. It was also, according to Bradley, the location where their father had discovered the most damaging documents before his death. The sisters parked their rental car in a visitor space near Building 7 and gathered their equipment. Emma's laptop contained sophisticated hacking tools disguised as routine security software, while Sarah carried a briefcase filled with blank forms and official-looking documents that would support their cover story. They also carried a small digital camera hidden in Emma's purse, which they planned to use to photograph any physical documents they couldn't download electronically. As they approached the entrance to Building 7, they encountered their first serious challenge. Unlike the main gate, this building had a more sophisticated security system, including biometric scanners and multiple checkpoint procedures. The contractor access card Bradley had provided would get them through the initial door, but beyond that, they would need to rely on their wits and Emma's technical skills. The lobby of Building 7 was staffed by a single security guard, Sergeant First Class Patricia Wong, who took her job much more seriously than Corporal Martinez at the main gate. Wong examined their identification cards carefully and asked detailed questions about their work assignment. Sarah smoothly provided answers based on their rehearsed cover story, explaining that they were there to conduct a routine security audit of the computer systems. Wong was not entirely satisfied with their explanation and reached for her phone to verify their assignment with the base's administrative office. This was the moment Emma had been preparing for. As Wong dialed, Emma activated a small device in her pocket that sent out a brief electronic signal. This signal interfered with the building's communication systems just long enough to make Wong's call fail to connect. Frustrated by the apparent phone malfunction but not wanting to delay what appeared to be an officially authorized inspection, Wong reluctantly allowed them to proceed. She did, however, insist on escorting them personally to the computer room, a precaution that the sisters had not anticipated. This meant they would need to be extremely careful about what they did once they gained access to the computer systems. The computer room in Building 7 was a climate-controlled environment filled with rows of servers and data storage devices. It was here that Fort Garrison stored all of its electronic records, including classified documents related to the base's research activities. Emma immediately began setting up her laptop, connecting it to the main server network using cables and adapters she had prepared in advance. While Emma worked on gaining access to the computer systems, Sarah engaged Sergeant Wong in conversation, trying to keep her attention focused away from what Emma was doing. Sarah asked detailed questions about the building's security procedures and expressed admiration for the base's impressive facilities. Wong, flattered by the attention and proud of her work, was happy to provide a detailed tour of the computer room and explanation of its security features. What Sergeant Wong didn't realize was that Emma was using their conversation as cover to install a sophisticated data extraction program on the base's main servers. This program, which Emma had spent weeks developing, was designed to search for and copy specific types of documents while leaving no trace of its activities. It would run in the background, gathering evidence of the illegal weapons testing and other activities that had led to their father's death. The program was also designed to be patient. Rather than attempting to download everything at once, which might trigger security alarms, it would work slowly over the course of several hours, copying small amounts of data at regular intervals. This meant that the sisters would need to find a way to remain on the base for an extended period, long enough for the program to complete its work. As Emma finished installing the data extraction program, an alarm suddenly began blaring throughout Building 7. For a moment, the sisters thought they had been discovered, but Sergeant Wong quickly explained, that this was just another training exercise, part of the intensive preparation for the upcoming Pentagon inspection. The timing was actually perfect, as it provided an excuse for them to leave the computer room and explore other parts of the base while their program continued its work. Over the next several hours, Sarah and Emma moved carefully through Fort Garrison, gathering additional evidence and taking photographs of facilities that matched descriptions in their father's emails. They visited the medical clinic where soldiers affected by the chemical weapons testing had been treated and later silenced. They located the storage facility where the illegal chemical agents were kept, carefully photographing the containers and their warning labels. Most importantly, they managed to access the office that had belonged to their father. The room had been cleaned out and reassigned to another soldier, but Emma's technical skills allowed her to recover deleted files from the computer that had been left behind. These files contained their father's final notes and observations, including a detailed list of all the personnel he believed were involved in the cover-up. As the day wore on, the sisters became increasingly confident that their mission would succeed. Emma's data extraction program was working perfectly, copying thousands of classified documents without detection. They had gathered photographic evidence of the illegal activities and recovered their father's final testimony. Everything they needed to expose the truth about Fort Garrison was finally within their grasp. But their success had not gone entirely unnoticed. Throughout the day, various base personnel had encountered the two young women claiming to be contractors. While none of these individuals had been immediately suspicious, several had mentioned the encounters to their supervisors. By late afternoon, a pattern was beginning to emerge, and questions were starting to be asked about who exactly these contractors were and what they were really doing on the base. The first serious red flag was raised by Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Torres, the base's deputy security chief. Torres had been reviewing the day's visitor logs as part of her routine security briefing when she noticed that the contractor identification cards used by the sisters were not listed in the base's official contractor database. When she tried to verify their work assignment, she discovered that no security audit had been scheduled for that day, and no contractors had been authorized to access Building 7. Torres immediately contacted Colonel Webb, who was in the middle of a meeting with Pentagon officials who had arrived early for their inspection. Webb's initial reaction was annoyance rather than alarm. He assumed that some administrative mistake had been made, that the contractors were legitimate but had been improperly processed through the system. However, Torres insisted that the situation required immediate investigation. As the afternoon turned to evening, Colonel Webb finally agreed to have base security conduct a search for the mysterious contractors. By this time, however, Sarah and Emma had completed most of their mission. Emma's data extraction program had successfully copied over 10,000 classified documents, including detailed records of the illegal weapons testing, financial records showing payments to personnel involved in the cover-up, and communications between base commanders and Pentagon officials discussing how to handle David Mitchell's inconvenient questions. The sisters had also discovered something that even their father had not known about. Fort Garrison was not just testing illegal chemical weapons, but was also involved in selling these weapons to foreign governments, including several nations that were supposedly enemies of the United States. The profits from these sales were being used to fund other classified operations that had never been approved by Congress or disclosed to the American public. As security teams began searching for them throughout the base, Sarah and Emma were preparing to make their exit. They had planned multiple escape routes, and Emma had also programmed several surprises into Fort Garrison's computer systems that would activate if they were caught or if anyone tried to stop their data extraction program. These surprises included automatic uploads of all the evidence they had gathered to multiple news organizations and government watchdog groups, ensuring that the truth would come out even if the sisters themselves were silenced. The sun was setting over the Nevada desert as Sarah and Emma made their way back to their rental car. They had been on the base for nearly 9 hours, and their mission had been more successful than they had dared to hope. Not only had they gathered the evidence needed to expose the illegal activities at Fort Garrison, but they had also uncovered an even larger conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the military establishment. But as they approached their car, they realized that their escape would not be as easy as their infiltration had been. Security teams were now actively patrolling the base, and checkpoints had been established at all exits. The casual security procedures that had allowed them to enter Fort Garrison undetected had been replaced by a full lockdown protocol. Every person and vehicle attempting to leave the base was being thoroughly searched and questioned. Sarah and Emma sat in their car for several minutes, considering their options. They could attempt to leave through the main gate and hope that their fake identification would hold up under more intensive scrutiny. They could try to find an alternate exit, though Emma's research had suggested that all routes off the base were equally well guarded, or they could find a place to hide on the base until the security alert passed, though this would mean spending the night in what was essentially enemy territory. It was Emma who suggested the fourth option. Rather than trying to escape immediately, they should use the remaining time to gather even more evidence. If they were going to be caught anyway, they might as well make sure they had everything they needed to bring down not just Fort Garrison, but the entire network of corruption and illegal activity that their father had died trying to expose. The decision to stay would prove to be both the most dangerous and the most important choice of their entire mission. Over the next 24 hours, the sisters would push their luck to the absolute limit, gathering evidence that would ultimately lead to the closure of Fort Garrison and the prosecution of dozens of military personnel. But first, they would have to survive the night in a place where they were now the most wanted fugitives in a facility designed to keep secrets buried forever. The decision to remain hidden on Fort Garrison overnight transformed Sarah and Emma from infiltrators into hunted prey. As darkness fell across the Nevada desert, the sisters found themselves trapped inside one of the most secure military facilities in the country, with every security officer on the base searching for them. What they didn't know was that their presence had triggered something far more dangerous than a simple security breach investigation. Colonel Webb had initially treated the situation as a minor embarrassment, an administrative failure that would require some paperwork and perhaps a few reprimands. However, when his security team discovered that the mysterious contractors had accessed Building 7 and the main computer servers, the stakes changed dramatically. A quick check of the server logs revealed that someone had been copying classified files for several hours. This was no longer a simple case of unauthorized access. It was a potential national security disaster. The first call Webb made was not to his immediate superiors, but to a secure number in Washington, D.C. that few people at Fort Garrison even knew existed. Within minutes, a team of specialists from the Defense Intelligence Agency was being dispatched to Nevada with orders to contain the situation by any means necessary. These specialists were not concerned with following normal military procedures or respecting civil rights. Their job was to protect national secrets, and they had broad authority to do whatever was necessary to accomplish that mission. Meanwhile, Sarah and Emma had found temporary refuge in an abandoned storage building on the outskirts of the base. The building had once been used to house construction equipment during Fort Garrison's expansion in the 1990s, but had been empty for years. Emma had discovered it during her research, noting that it didn't appear on current base maps and was far from any regular patrol routes. It was the perfect place to hide while they decided their next move. The sisters used their phones to upload copies of the evidence they had gathered to secure cloud storage accounts, ensuring that their father's story would survive even if they didn't. Emma also activated the dead man's switch she had built into her data extraction program. If she didn't check in every 12 hours, the program would automatically send all of their evidence to a predetermined list of journalists, government officials, and human rights organizations around the world. As they worked by the light of their phone screens, the sisters began to realize the full scope of what they had uncovered. The illegal weapons testing at Fort Garrison was just one part of a much larger operation that involved multiple military bases, defense contractors, and government officials. The documents Emma's program had extracted included communications with facilities in other states, shipping manifests for chemical weapons being sent to foreign countries, and financial records showing millions of dollars in unauthorized payments. The most shocking discovery was a series of emails between Colonel Webb and officials at the Pentagon discussing what to do about Master Sergeant David Mitchell. The emails made it clear that their father's death had not been accidental. He had been poisoned with one of the same chemical agents he had been investigating, and his death had been deliberately made to look like a heart attack. The emails also revealed that several other whistleblowers had met similar fates over the years. Reading these communications was devastating for both sisters, but it also strengthened their resolve. Their father had been murdered for trying to do the right thing, and they were now the only people who could ensure that his sacrifice had not been in vain. They had to find a way to get the evidence they had gathered to the outside world, no matter what the cost. The first sign that their situation had become even more dangerous came around midnight, when they heard helicopters circling overhead. Through a broken window in their hiding place, they could see multiple aircraft with searchlights sweeping across the base. This was far more security activity than would be justified by two trespassing civilians. It suggested that someone in authority knew exactly who they were and what they had found. Emma's laptop chimed softly, indicating that her data extraction program had finished its work. Over the past 15 hours, it had copied more than 50,000 classified documents from Fort Garrison's servers, including files that dated back more than a decade. The program had also discovered and accessed several hidden directories that contained the most sensitive material, files that were encrypted and stored separately from the base's regular archives. Among these hidden files were detailed records of experiments conducted on military personnel without their knowledge or consent. The sisters learned that their father had not been the first person to discover these activities. Over the years, at least a dozen service members had raised questions about unexplained illnesses and suspicious deaths among their colleagues. All of these individuals had either died under mysterious circumstances or been transferred to remote assignments where they could be closely monitored. The files also revealed that Fort Garrison was part of a network of facilities involved in developing chemical and biological weapons that were banned under international law. These weapons were being tested not only on military personnel, but also on civilian populations in foreign countries where the United States military was conducting operations. The goal was to develop agents that could disable enemy forces without leaving obvious evidence of their use. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the sisters discovered that some of these illegal weapons had been used against American civilians during domestic military exercises. Several unexplained outbreaks of illness in communities near military bases were actually the result of unauthorized testing of chemical agents. The affected civilians had never been told the real cause of their illnesses, and many had died without ever knowing they had been victims of their own government's illegal activities. As Sarah and Emma absorbed the full horror of what they had uncovered, they heard vehicles approaching their hiding place. Through the broken window, they could see military trucks and armed personnel surrounding the abandoned storage building. Somehow, despite their careful planning and Emma's technical expertise, they had been discovered. The voice that came through a loudspeaker was calm and professional, but carried an unmistakable threat. "This is Colonel Webb, base commander of Fort Garrison. You are surrounded and have no means of escape. Exit the building immediately with your hands visible, and you will not be harmed. Any attempt to resist or flee will be met with appropriate force." Sarah looked at her younger sister and saw her own fears reflected in Emma's eyes. They both knew that the promise of safety was a lie. They had uncovered evidence of murder, illegal weapons testing, and treason at the highest levels of the military establishment. The people responsible for these crimes would not simply allow them to walk away and tell their story to the world. Emma quickly activated the final phase of her contingency plan. With a few keystrokes, she uploaded all of their evidence to multiple secure servers around the world and sent encrypted copies to journalists in 6 different countries. She also activated a program that would begin automatically releasing documents to social media platforms and news websites if she didn't check in within the next 4 hours. The sisters had prepared for this possibility, but they had hoped it wouldn't come to this. They knew that once the evidence was released publicly, there would be no going back. The military establishment would use every resource at its disposal to discredit them and suppress the story. They would become targets for assassination, and their lives as they knew them would be over. But as they heard soldiers taking positions around their building and saw laser sights beginning to appear through the broken windows, they realized they had no choice. Their father had died trying to expose the truth about Fort Garrison, and they were the only ones who could finish what he had started. Sarah made the decision for both of them. "Do it," she whispered to Emma. "Release everything." Emma hit the enter key, and within seconds, thousands of classified documents began appearing on servers around the world. The dead man's switch had been activated, and there was no way to stop it. Within hours, journalists and government officials in multiple countries would have access to detailed evidence of illegal activities by the United States military. The reaction was immediate. Emma's laptop screen began showing automated confirmations as news organizations received and acknowledged the document transfers. At the same time, they could hear increased activity outside their building as more military personnel arrived on the scene. Colonel Webb's voice came through the loudspeaker again, but this time there was an edge of desperation in his tone. "We know you have uploaded classified materials to outside servers. This constitutes an act of treason against the United States. However, if you surrender immediately and cooperate with our investigation, we may be able to work out an arrangement that protects your interests." The sisters knew better than to believe such promises. The people they were dealing with had already committed murder to protect their secrets, and they would not hesitate to kill again. Sarah and Emma's only hope was to survive long enough for their evidence to reach the public and for the story to become too big to suppress. The standoff continued for several more hours. The military personnel surrounding the building seemed to be waiting for orders from higher authorities, possibly trying to determine how much damage had already been done and what their options were for containing the situation. During this time, Emma continued to monitor her automated upload systems, ensuring that all of the evidence was being properly distributed to journalists and government officials. As dawn approached, the sisters could hear increased radio chatter from the soldiers outside. It became clear that senior officials from Washington had arrived on the scene and were taking direct control of the situation. The tone of the communications was becoming more urgent, suggesting that news organizations were already beginning to ask questions about the documents they had received. At 6:30 a.m., exactly 21 hours after they had first entered Fort Garrison, the sisters heard a new voice through the loudspeaker. This speaker identified himself as General Patricia Morrison from the Defense Intelligence Agency, and her tone was markedly different from Colonel Webb's earlier attempts at negotiation. "Sarah and Emma Mitchell," General Morrison announced, "you are in possession of classified materials that pose a direct threat to national security. You have 10 minutes to exit the building and surrender yourselves for processing. If you do not comply, we will be forced to take more direct action to resolve this situation." The threat was clear, but so was the opportunity. The fact that they were being given 10 minutes suggested that officials in Washington were still trying to figure out how to handle the situation. They couldn't simply eliminate the sisters without knowing how much evidence had been released and to whom it had been sent. This uncertainty was the only thing keeping Sarah and Emma alive. Emma used the time to send additional copies of their evidence to backup locations and to activate several more automated release systems. She also sent personal messages to friends and family members, explaining what had happened and asking them to watch for news stories about Fort Garrison in the coming days. Meanwhile, Sarah was preparing for what she knew might be their final confrontation. She had no illusions about their chances of survival once they left their hiding place, but she was determined to make sure their story was told. She used her phone to record a video statement explaining everything they had discovered and why they had taken such extreme risks to expose the truth. The 10-minute deadline passed without the sisters surrendering, and the response was swift and overwhelming. Tear gas canisters crashed through the windows of the storage building, filling the interior with choking smoke. Through the chaos, Sarah and Emma could hear soldiers breaking down the doors and moving into the building. The sisters had prepared for this moment as well. They had located a maintenance tunnel that connected the storage building to the base's utility systems, and they had cleared a path through the debris and equipment that blocked access to this tunnel. As the soldiers stormed into the main part of the building, Sarah and Emma slipped into the tunnel and began crawling toward an exit point nearly half a mile away. The tunnel was cramped, dark, and filled with pipes and electrical conduits that made movement difficult. But it had one crucial advantage. It was not shown on any of the current base maps, and the soldiers searching for them didn't know it existed. Emma had discovered the tunnel during her research, finding references to it in construction documents from the 90s that had been archived in the base's digital records. As they crawled through the tunnel, the sisters could hear the sounds of the search continuing above them. Soldiers were systematically going through every building on the base, and they could hear helicopters and vehicles moving in all directions. The entire facility was in lockdown, with no one allowed to enter or leave until the fugitives were found. The tunnel exit was located in a pump house that serviced the base's water treatment facility. Emma had chosen this location because it was in a relatively isolated part of Fort Garrison, far from the main administrative and residential areas where most of the search activity was concentrated. The pump house was also surrounded by industrial equipment and storage tanks that would provide cover if they needed to move to another hiding place. When they finally emerged from the tunnel, dirty and exhausted, the sisters found themselves in a very different situation from the one they had left behind. Their escape had bought them several hours, but it had also escalated the security response to unprecedented levels. They could see military vehicles patrolling every road on the base, and the sound of helicopters was constant. More importantly, Emma's phone was receiving a steady stream of notifications indicating that their evidence was already having an impact in the outside world. News organizations were beginning to publish preliminary stories based on the documents they had received, and government officials were being forced to respond to questions about the activities at Fort Garrison. The first major breakthrough came when the Washington Post published a front-page story titled, "Secret Military Facility Accused of Illegal Weapons Testing." The story included details from several of the documents Sarah and Emma had obtained, including communications that clearly showed knowledge of illegal activities at the highest levels of command. Within hours, other major news organizations were following up with their own stories, and social media was buzzing with discussions about the revelations. The story was becoming too big and too public for military officials to simply suppress through their usual methods of intimidation and classification. But the sisters' immediate situation was becoming increasingly desperate. They had been on the run for more than 24 hours, with little food or water and no safe place to rest. The base-wide search was intensifying, and it was only a matter of time before they were discovered. They needed to find a way off Fort Garrison, but every exit was heavily guarded, and their faces were now known to every security officer on the base. It was at this moment that they received an unexpected message on Emma's encrypted phone. The message was from Tom Bradley, the contractor who had provided them with access cards and inside information about the base. Bradley had been watching the news coverage and had realized that the sisters were still trapped inside Fort Garrison, despite the enormous personal risk he was offering to help them escape. Bradley's message included detailed instructions for reaching a maintenance gate on the eastern perimeter of the base that was not regularly monitored. He would meet them there with a vehicle and help them get to safety. It was a desperate plan with little chance of success, but it was the only option they had. As they prepared to make their final run for freedom, Sarah and Emma took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. In just 48 hours, they had accomplished something that seemed impossible. They had infiltrated one of the most secure military facilities in the country and exposed evidence of crimes that reached into the highest levels of government. Their father would have been proud of what they had achieved, but the sisters knew that their work was far from over. The evidence they had released would need to be verified and acted upon by authorities who were willing to stand up to the military establishment. There would be investigations, trials, and almost certainly attempts to discredit or silence them. But for now, their focus was simply on survival. They had started something that could not be stopped, and they needed to live long enough to see it through to its conclusion. The warning their father had tried to give had finally been heard, and the entire foundation of Fort Garrison was beginning to crumble under the weight of the truth. As they prepared to leave their hiding place and make their desperate run for the perimeter, Sarah looked at her younger sister with a mixture of pride and fear. They had achieved their goal, but at a cost that was still being calculated. In the next few hours, they would discover whether their sacrifice had been worth it, and whether the truth they had exposed would be enough to bring down the entire network of corruption and illegal activity that had cost their father his life. The sun was rising over Fort Garrison for the second time since their infiltration began, but this sunrise was different. This time, the light was shining on a story that could no longer be hidden, and on two sisters who had proven that sometimes the most dangerous enemies of corruption are the people that power underestimates most. The final 12 hours of the Fort Garrison crisis began with a desperate sprint across a quarter-mile of open desert terrain. Sarah and Emma Mitchell, exhausted from their 36-hour ordeal inside the military facility, found themselves running for their lives as searchlights swept the ground behind them. Tom Bradley had kept his promise, meeting them at the maintenance gate with an old pickup truck, and a plan that was their only hope of escape. But even as the sisters fled into the Nevada darkness, the real battle was just beginning. In newsrooms, government offices, and military command centers around the world, the evidence they had released was creating a firestorm that would ultimately reshape American military policy and lead to the largest military corruption scandal in modern history. The first major development came at 7:15 a.m. Eastern Time, when Senator Margaret Chen, chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, called an emergency press conference. Senator Chen had received copies of the Fort Garrison documents through secure channels and had spent the night reviewing them with her staff and legal advisors. What she announced to the packed press room sent shockwaves through Washington. "Based on evidence that has come to my attention," Senator Chen declared, "I am calling for an immediate suspension of all activities at Fort Garrison and a full congressional investigation into allegations of illegal weapons testing, murder, and treason by military personnel." The senator went on to detail specific findings from the documents, including the systematic poisoning of military personnel and the sale of banned weapons to foreign governments. The military's initial response was predictable: complete denial and attempts to discredit the evidence as fabricated or taken out of context. Colonel Webb, who had been relieved of command just hours earlier, was presented at a Pentagon press conference as a decorated officer who had been the victim of a sophisticated cyber attack by unknown enemies of the United States, but the evidence was too overwhelming and too detailed to be dismissed as fake. Emma's data extraction program had captured not just individual documents, but entire email chains, financial records, and even audio recordings of meetings where illegal activities were discussed. The timestamps, metadata, and cross-references all confirmed the authenticity of the materials. Meanwhile, journalists around the world were working frantically to verify and contextualize the massive document dump. The Washington Post had assigned a team of 12 reporters to the story, working in coordination with investigators from the New York Times, The Guardian, and several other major news organizations. Their preliminary analysis confirmed that the documents appeared to be genuine and contained evidence of serious crimes. The international implications began to emerge as foreign governments started asking questions about the banned weapons that had allegedly been sold to them. Several European allies demanded immediate explanations from the State Department, while countries that had been identified as purchasers of the illegal weapons began distancing themselves from any connection to Fort Garrison. Back in Nevada, Sarah and Emma were discovering that escaping from Fort Garrison was only the beginning of their ordeal. Tom Bradley had driven them to a small town about 50 miles from the base, where they had planned to contact journalists and tell their story directly to the media. But when they arrived at the motel Bradley had chosen as their safe house, they found it surrounded by unmarked vehicles. The sisters realized they had walked into a trap. Bradley, despite his apparent good intentions, had been under surveillance by military intelligence officers who had been monitoring his communications with the Mitchell family. His offer to help them escape had been allowed to proceed specifically so that officials could track down the sisters and eliminate them before they could provide additional testimony about what they had discovered. What the military officials didn't know was that Emma had anticipated this possibility. Before leaving Fort Garrison, she had programmed additional safeguards into her automated release systems. If she didn't check in every 6 hours, new waves of documents would be released to journalists and government officials around the world. She had also arranged for encrypted communications with several investigative reporters who were expecting to hear from her at specific times. The standoff at the motel lasted for several hours, with federal agents demanding that the sisters surrender while Emma continued to monitor news coverage on her phone. The story was spreading faster than anyone had expected, with social media amplifying the revelations and putting pressure on government officials to take immediate action. The breakthrough came when Senator Chen's office received a phone call from Emma's encrypted phone. Despite being surrounded by federal agents, Emma was able to establish a secure connection with the senator's staff and provide additional details about the evidence she had gathered. More importantly, she was able to confirm that the documents being reported in the media were authentic and that she had access to even more damaging materials that had not yet been released. Senator Chen immediately contacted the Attorney General and demanded federal protection for the Mitchell sisters as whistleblowers. The senator argued that the sisters had exposed evidence of serious crimes and were entitled to protection under federal whistleblower statutes. This legal intervention forced federal agents to step back and allowed the sisters to be transferred to federal protective custody rather than being detained by military authorities. The next 24 hours saw a cascade of developments that would ultimately lead to the complete shutdown of Fort Garrison and criminal charges against dozens of military personnel and government officials. The FBI opened formal investigations into the illegal weapons testing, the murders of David Mitchell and other whistleblowers, and the unauthorized sale of banned weapons to foreign governments. International pressure also began to mount as more details emerged about the global scope of the illegal activities. The United Nations Security Council called an emergency session to discuss the allegations, and several countries threatened to withdraw from military cooperation agreements with the United States unless the full scope of the illegal activities was disclosed and those responsible were prosecuted. Colonel Webb, faced with overwhelming evidence of his involvement in the cover-up, agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed that the illegal activities at Fort Garrison were part of a much larger network of similar operations at military facilities around the country. Webb provided names, dates, and locations that allowed investigators to begin unraveling the entire conspiracy. The most shocking revelation came when investigators discovered that several high-ranking Pentagon officials had been personally profiting from the illegal weapon sales. Bank records obtained through federal subpoenas showed millions of dollars in payments to offshore accounts controlled by these officials. The money trail led all the way to the office of the Deputy Secretary of Defense, who resigned in disgrace as federal agents arrived at his home with arrest warrants. General Morrison, the Defense Intelligence Agency official who had overseen the final hours of the Fort Garrison crisis, was arrested on charges of treason, murder, and conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism against American citizens. The evidence against her was overwhelming, including audio recordings of her ordering the deaths of several military personnel who had asked questions about the illegal activities. The trials that followed became some of the most closely watched legal proceedings in American history. Sarah and Emma Mitchell testified before Congress, grand juries, and eventually at the criminal trials of the personnel involved in the conspiracy. Their testimony was compelling and detailed, and it was corroborated by the massive amount of documentary evidence they had obtained during their infiltration of Fort Garrison. The ultimate scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Investigators eventually determined that illegal weapons testing had been conducted at more than a dozen military facilities over a period of 15 years. Hundreds of military personnel and civilians had been unknowingly exposed to banned chemical and biological agents, and at least 40 people had died as a result of these exposures. The financial corruption was equally extensive. More than $500 million in taxpayer funds had been diverted to fund the illegal activities, and millions more had been generated through the unauthorized sale of banned weapons to foreign governments and private organizations. Some of these weapons had eventually been used by terrorist organizations against American interests overseas. Fort Garrison itself was permanently closed and designated as a Superfund environmental cleanup site due to contamination from years of illegal chemical weapons testing. The base's closure eliminated more than 2,000 jobs and devastated the local economy, but federal investigators determined that the facility could never be safely reopened due to the extent of the contamination. The congressional investigation led by Senator Chen resulted in sweeping reforms to military oversight procedures and new protections for military whistleblowers. The senator used the Fort Garrison scandal to push through legislation that had been stalled in committee for years, including requirements for independent oversight of all military research activities and criminal penalties for officers who retaliate against personnel who report illegal activities. The international ramifications continued for years after the initial revelations. Several countries that had been identified as purchasers of the illegal weapons faced international sanctions, and the United States was forced to pay billions of dollars in compensation to allies whose trust had been violated by the illegal sales. The scandal also led to a comprehensive review of American military activities around the world and new restrictions on overseas weapons testing. For Sarah and Emma Mitchell, the aftermath of their 48-hour infiltration of Fort Garrison was both triumphant and traumatic. They had achieved their goal of exposing the truth about their father's death and the illegal activities that had cost so many lives, but the personal cost was enormous. They lived under federal protection for more than 2 years while the various legal proceedings played out, and they faced constant threats from supporters of the military personnel who had been prosecuted.